I left. One of the worst things that prison does to a man is imbue him with the feeling that he is always in the wrong, that others might rightfully do what they will with him, while the things he does, through error or otherwise, are wholly inexcusable. I felt that way about Doc, about the way he had seen Lila and me. I was certain by now that I was being forced to work against myself. I was sure that I owed him nothing, apologies included. Still, I did feel guilty, and I couldn't help it. I stayed away from the house until almost midnight that night, and got away early the next morning. By the evening of that day, some of my sense of guilt had worn off. I was still uneasy, but I hoped, if he noticed the fact, he would attribute it to the business over the car. I brought the subject up as soon as he stepped inside my room. "I should have known that Myrtle would read the legal papers." "I appreciate it just the same." "Don't mention it, Pat. We'll try to do better next year." He left after a quick drink with me. I flopped down on the bed, relieved, and hating myself for being relieved. Willie came in to remove my dinner dishes, and I tried to tell myself that it was he and not Doc who had looked in on Lila and me. He would have been in the house, while Doc would have had no reason to be there. But I knew better than that. It had been Doc. He'd expected me to come there because of the car. And when he'd seen Lila and me, why hadn't he reacted as he should? As the insanely jealous Doc I knew would have. Did he intend to settle with me later, when I was least expecting it? Or had he held off for purely practical reasons, because a blow-up would spoil the plan in which I played a part? It could be either way or both. And it could be that Doc actually didn't care about his wife. That the jealousy was all an act. I got up and paced the floor, excited. It had been an act. Looking back now, I could see how it had been overplayed. Doc showing up always at the most embarrassing moment. Lila haughtily dramatic, taunting him, throwing whiskey in his face. It had been rotten acting, but I had been taken in by it. I had been so impressed that I was afraid Doc might drop my parole. I had told Hardesty that, hinted that I might skip out, and immediately the funny business had stopped. They didn't want me to leave. They'd wanted only to build up Doc in my mind as a certain type of person. It all added up. Hardesty had told Doc how I felt, and Doc had told Lila to leave me alone. He'd followed me to the house the day before to reassure me in case Lila fell down on the job. And when he saw Lila apparently was doing more than all right, he'd gone quietly away again. But what about Hardesty? Why, when he so obviously distrusted and detested Doc, had he told him of my visit? He wanted me to share his distrust and hatred. He meant to work me up to the point where I would. I was not yet, in his opinion, sufficiently worked up. I was not ready to be used. Myrtle Briscoe. Myrtle was using me to get Doc. I was a rope she was giving him with which to hang himself. And Doc had foreseen that she would know and guessed that she would react as she had. He was tolling out rope of his own. He was certain he could tighten it before she could tighten hers. And Mrs. Luther? Was she working with one of the three, or did she too have a plan? And Madeline? No, not Madeline. I'd never had the slightest doubt about her. My instinct told me just one thing about her, that she was good and that she loved me. And if I was wrong about that, then I was wrong about everything. Maybe I was. I didn't know anything. All I had was guesses. If Eggleston was wrong about the pardon, then most of my conjecturing collapsed. Doc might be my friend. It could be that he had become aware that we were being pressed towards a dangerous situation and that he intended to avoid it at all costs. Oh, hell, though. That couldn't be right. I gave up. I undressed and got in bed, and I went to sleep. You can only think so much, and I was far ahead of my quota for the day. The next day was the beginning of my second 30-day period on parole. I called Myrtle Briscoe's office from a drugstore and asked what time I should report. She told me curtly that I needn't bother to come in unless there was something I wanted to tell her. I said there wasn't. She banged down the receiver. It wasn't much after 9 when I reached Madeline's apartment, and she was still in bed. Instead of coming to the living room door, she stuck her head out the other one, the one to her bedroom. She closed it after me, gave me a fiercely affectionate hug, and flung herself down on the bed again. She was wearing white sleeping shorts and a white sleeveless pullover. She sprawled out on the pillows and yawned.
Oh, so tired. Make me some coffee, huh, honey?
All right.
I'll get into something while you're gone so you won't be thinking evil thoughts.
I told her I never had such things and went on back to the kitchen. I put a pot of coffee on the stove and slipped a couple of pieces of bread into the toaster. While they were getting ready, I put a napkin on the tray, laid out marmalade and butter, and sliced an orange. The whole business didn't take more than 5 minutes. I picked up the tray and started for the bedroom. And then I halted in the kitchen door and stood staring. The bedroom door was still open, and I could see her almost as plainly as though I'd been in the room with her. And what I saw sent a cold chill of shock along my spine. The sleeping trunks and pullover lay on the floor at her feet. She got into a pair of thin white panties, and her hands were behind her, working at the clasp of her brassiere. She was completely lost in thought. She wasn't thinking about dressing, but about something, someone, and those thoughts were anything but pleasant. Always before, even when she was serious, she'd appeared good-humored. I'd never seen her any other way. She'd never let me see her any other way. And now not a vestige of that good humor remained. I could hardly believe it was the same woman. This woman whose face was a sinister mask of hatred. I stepped back into the kitchen and waited a minute or two. Then I began to whistle and started for the bedroom again.
What took you so long?
Oh, I took my time. I didn't want to catch you undressed.
No, I'm sure you wouldn't want to do that.
I poured coffee and sat down on the bed with her. She'd put on a pair of slacks and a sweater and was propped up on the pillows, her knees drawn up. For the first time since I'd met her, I found it difficult to talk, to respond to her impish chatter. It was grotesque in the light of what I'd just seen. I had the impression of being drawn into a game while a flood tide rose around my neck. She finished eating and I lighted a cigarette for her. My hand trembled a little as I held out the match, and she steadied it with her own hand.
What's the matter with you this morning, Pat?
Matter? She didn't say anything. She merely lay back, waiting, her brown eyes inscrutable. I've been a little worried. Maybe that's it.
Worried about what?
About what's going to happen to me. About what is happening to me. I told her about the car and my talk with Myrtle Briscoe. At some point in the telling, she suddenly sat up and gripped my fingers.
Pat, had you thought about telling Myrtle?
Yes, I've thought about telling her everything. It might send me back to Sandstone, but I think I'd have plenty of company on the trip. She released my fingers.
Why don't you do it?
Her voice was flat, her gaze as steady as mine. I'd made a threat, and what it had got me I didn't know. Advice or another threat. I'm sorry. You're the only person I know to turn to, and turning to you doesn't seem to do any good. There's no reason why it should, of course, why you should help me.
Do you really believe that, Pat?
I don't know what to believe.
No. And there's your answer to everything. You don't see anyone's problems but your own. You don't trust anyone but yourself. The fact that I won't tell you everything I know is interpreted to mean that I'm against you. That's all you can see.
I don't think that.
Yes, you do, Pat. And you're wrong in doing it. I haven't told you any more than I have because it isn't a good thing for you to know it. You'd blunder into something that you're not big enough to handle.
I'm supposed to sit still and do nothing?
That's about it. It has to be it for the present, honey. Whenever there is anything to be done, I'll let you know.
She squeezed my hand, and then she sat up and put her arms around me. She drew me down to the pillows, her cheek against mine, her lips moving against my ear.
Poor Pat. He mustn't worry anymore. In just a little while now, all his troubles will be over.
The trap was snapping shut. I could feel it. A sensation of things rushing in on me from every side. On Monday morning, I stopped by the Capitol to leave a bunch of survey forms for Rita Kennedy. Appearances had to be kept up. Firmly entrenched as the Highway Department crowd was, even they were not taking unnecessary chances in an election year. Rita Kennedy wasn't in, and she left word that she wanted to see me. I passed the day reading and driving and went back to the Capitol again that evening. Rita took the forms I handed her with a crisp smile.
I hope I didn't inconvenience you by not being here this morning, Pat.
Not at all.
I'm glad to hear it. Is it raining out?
Starting to.
Oh, damn. I'll never be able to get a taxi this time in the evening. And, of course, this is the one day when I wouldn't bring my umbrella.
I got my car here. State car, that is, if you'd care to have me.
I would. I want to get out of here.
I helped her on with her coat, and she gave my arm a little squeeze as we went out the door. She held onto my arm all the way down the corridor and out to the car. She didn't exactly lean away from me.
I've been meaning to talk to you for some time, Pat. We'll wait until we get to my apartment.
She gave me her address, and I stopped in front of a large apartment house, and a doorman with an umbrella ushered us to the door. An elevator shot us up to some floor near the top. I don't know how many rooms there were in the apartment, but I know it must have been large and expensive. It was the kind of place you have when you like good things and have the money to buy them for a long time. A maid in a white cap took our wraps, and Rita asked me what I'd like to drink. Scotch will do me fine.
I'll have the same. Sit down there by the fire, Pat.
I took a chair in front of the fireplace, and Rita came over and stood by the mantel. When the drinks came, she nodded to me over her glass, lifted it, and set it down almost empty.
Something tells me that that's quite a little bit better than they served in Sandstone.
Yes, it is.
We went into your background thoroughly, Pat. Believe it or not, we're extremely careful about whom we hire in the highway department.
You must be.
I think you'll get along all right, Pat, if you'll come to your senses. Have you found yourself a new sponsor yet? Berkman's out, you know.
No, I didn't know he was out.
Oh, yes. Losing the election is only a formality. We weren't positive when we took you on, and we never did put a lid on until we are positive. Fortunately for you and a lot of others. We're the largest of all the departments. We have the most jobs. That enables us, the top handful, to perpetuate ourselves. If we see a likely-looking candidate, we may start handing him patronage, even though the election is a year off. When we see a man on the downgrade, we shake him. We kick his job holders out. We've shaken Berkman.
And you're kicking his people out?
We've kicked them out, all except you. I thought we might make a trade with you.
What kind of trade?
A job for some information.
I don't have any information you could use.
I'm probably a better judge of that than you are. We're curious. We think there may be straws in the wind we can't see. Doc's taken a lot of trouble with you. He's pretty good at playing both ends against the middle himself. What's the answer?
I shook my head. I hardly knew her. This was going too far, too fast. I don't know the answer. I couldn't tell you if I did. Doc took me out of Sandstone.
And he could send you back?
Yes, but I don't need threats to keep me from double-crossing my friends. She nodded, smiling a little, as if she'd expected me to say that.
I think a stretch in the penitentiary might do a lot of my acquaintances some good, Pat. Well, you can have the job anyway. Another drink?
No, thanks. And perhaps you'd better not let me keep the job.
Nonsense. You're being melodramatic. If you can pick up any valuable information around there, I'll split the proceeds with you. Nope. The only way you'll be able to help Doc is to give him part of your salary.
I'll be glad to do that.
You're planning to stay with us, then? I wondered. You see, we watch car transfers pretty closely. I thought you might be going away.
No, ma'am. It's an old car. What I'll probably do is fix it up and resell it.
I see.
I couldn't leave, Miss Kennedy. I'd be breaking my parole.
So I understood. I wondered if you did. You'd have a great deal to lose by leaving, Pat. Have you read a book called Sappho, Pat?
No. Yes, Alphonse Daudet, wasn't it?
The hero had strong obligations, too, if you remember. A career, a proud family, and all he had to gain was a harlot, an unusually lovely harlot. But aren't they all when a man falls in love with them?
I don't know what you're talking about.
I'm talking about Mrs. Luther.
I think I sighed inwardly with relief.
It would be very easy for you to fall in love with her. I wouldn't blame you at all.
But I'm not. She couldn't have heard anything. If there was that much talk, if it had already got to her.
What would you do if I called you a liar?
Well, from you, I'd take it.
If I were you, I'd do a great deal of thinking. Doc has gone through a lot for that wife of his, and he won't give her up easily. There's a blind spot in every man. There's something he'd kill for. Leave Mrs. Luther alone, and don't let her have anything to do with you.
Maybe I don't see what you're driving at, Miss Kennedy. Mrs. Luther is inclined to make up to a man, whether the man is interested or not.
That isn't what I mean.
I got up. I appreciate you talking to me, Miss Kennedy. But you seem to have heard something that just isn't true. Someone's been misrepresenting me to you.
No one misrepresents anything to me.
Well, I don't blame you for not wanting to stick your neck out. But if there's talk going around...
Good night, Pat. This conversation was strictly between us. You don't need to worry about that.
What do I need to worry about?
Good night.
She smiled, but she sounded angry or disgusted. It was almost as if she had said, "Good God." I rode back downstairs and jumped in the car, slamming the door after me. It was late now, and the rain made the night darker. I didn't know he was there until he spoke. Until a match flared and raised up to a face beneath a slouch-brimmed hat. I recognized him just in time to stop the swing I'd started. "That is a good way of getting killed, Mr. Eggleston." "There is no good way of getting killed, Mr. Cosgrove. I see your point, though. I didn't realize I was quite so invisible." "How'd you find me?" "Find you? You mean you're trying to avoid discovery? You know what I mean. Yes, well, it wasn't a task that strained my professional capabilities. Whoever got your parole would have strong political connections. Those connections would almost certainly be used in getting you a job. A few hours of observation, a few discreet inquiries, and here I am. You followed me from the Capitol? I thought it would be better, say, than calling you at Dr. Luther's. I turned the switch key and stepped on the starter. His cigarette arched down to the floor, and I heard his heel grind it out. I heard something else, too. Going someplace, Mr. Cosgrove? I thought I'd drive someplace where we could talk. We can talk very well here, but drive on, if you like. I only hope you will do nothing that will make it necessary for me to shoot you. Hell, I laughed and shut off the motor. Why would I do anything like that? Because you might feel I was dangerous to you, whereas I'm actually your shield. I have much more to sell you than silence. Well, let's hear it. A question or two first. Number one, what prompted Dr. Luther to get your parole? Did you talk with him while he was visiting Sandstone, or I wrote him a letter? Him and 100 others. He was the only one to respond. Good, very good. You had no acquaintance with him whatsoever, right? Right. I've already told you that. Question number two, how long was it after you wrote this letter before Dr. Luther acted in your behalf? I don't know exactly. Must have been about 3 months. I think it must have been, too, Mr. Cosgrove. In fact, I take an oath on it. Now, just a minute. How do you know that? Because the time corresponds with another act. A series of acts, I should say, by Dr. Luther. Acts which provide the motive for your parole. Now, question number three. Has anything happened which would incline you to believe that you might be forced into a disastrous quarrel with Dr. Luther? Yes. Mrs. Luther? Mrs. Luther. I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting the lady. Is she a raving beauty, the kind to successfully inspire a mortal quarrel? Not for my money, but a lot of men would be crazy about her. You probably seen her type, tall, blonde, beautiful, and a bum. Well, that's about all, Mr. Cosgrove, except for a rhetorical question. Have you dwelt any on the fact that Dr. Luther is now approaching the end of his political career, and that he must have seen the beginning of that end at about the time he received your letter? I've thought about it a great deal. And? All right, I'm curious. I'm more than curious. What have you got to tell me? Nothing more, Mr. Cosgrove, until I am convinced in a very concrete manner that my words will be appreciated. How much? 500. I haven't got it. A technicality. You can get it. Any man who's done as much time as you have in a place like Sandstone knows how to get money. You think I'm gonna... I think you're gonna do whatever is necessary to get that 500. What are you gonna tell me for 500? The answer to your riddle. How to keep Pat Cosgrove alive and at liberty. When you know what I know and make certain parties acquainted with that fact, your troubles will vanish even as the legendary snowball in hell. I'm pretty much mixed up. I don't see how... How soon do you want the money? No later than tomorrow night, say 6 o'clock. That isn't much time. I don't think you have very much, Mr. Cosgrove. From the way things are shaping up, I think your time is running out very fast. Unless you know what I know by tomorrow night, I don't think it will be of much value to you or to me. But 6 o'clock, something might come up that I couldn't get away that early. Could you make it after dinner, around 8? That will be after dark. The other tenants will be out of their offices. What of it? I'll be expecting trouble from you. Expecting it, Mr. Cosgrove. So I wouldn't bring anything with me if I were in your place but the money. Oh, hell. What would it get me? 8 o'clock, then? I'll be there. Doc was backing his car out as I stepped off the porch, and I stood and waited for him. He stopped and called to me, smiling. How's the job going, Pat? Haven't kicked you out yet, have they? Why, no. Were they supposed to? Maybe not. Maybe a little early yet. They haven't said anything to you about Berkman, huh? Not a word. Is there some trouble? Nothing that you need to worry about. We'll have to get you a new sponsor, but that shouldn't be difficult. Any number of the boys should be glad to come through for you. I'm glad to hear it. But I suspect we should be getting you a little better acquainted. Suppose you make it a point to be on hand tomorrow night around 8 o'clock. I'm having a group in at that time. I said I'd be there. With a sigh of relief, I watched him back out of the driveway and drive off. If he'd said tonight at 8, I couldn't have met Eggleston, and if I missed out on that, it would have been far better for me if I had missed out. I drove out to the Capitol building, circled around it, and headed back toward town. I backtracked on my trail several times, making sure that no one was following me, and reached the business district in about an hour. I put the car in a parking lot and went to a picture show. I left the show by a side exit, ate lunch, and spent a couple of hours at the library. After that, I did some shopping. I bought a small but strong pair of wire snips, a roll of adhesive tape, a pair of gloves, and a pocket flashlight, all in different stores. I went into a public toilet, unwrapped the articles, and stowed them away in my pockets. I came out to the street again and sauntered slowly toward the market district. It was now a little after 5 in the afternoon. Catty-cornered to the building in which Eggleston had his offices was a working man's bar. It was a grimy place. I wouldn't have eaten in it for pay, and I was sure Eggleston wouldn't. I sat down at the bar near the entrance and ordered a drink. I glanced out the fly-specked window. The view wasn't as good as I'd like to have had. I could see the windows of Eggleston's offices, but I couldn't see the entrance to the building. That was on the side street back near the alley. I sipped my drink, waiting, watching his office windows. At 6 o'clock, lights started coming on in the building. Some of them stayed on, but most went off after a few minutes. The shades at Eggleston's windows were drawn, and I had to stare hard to determine whether the lights were on or not. At last, around 6:30, when it was getting dark, I saw the broken lines of light around the shades. I saw them just in time to see them disappear. That left all the offices on his floor dark. It was better than I'd hoped for. I waited 15 minutes, then left the bar. There were 2 elevators in the building, but only one was running at this time of night. I began looking at the office directory. "Help you with something, mister?" I shook my head without looking around. He muttered something under his breath, and his stool creaked as he sat down again. Then the elevator signal buzzed, and he said, "God damn," and he got up and rattled the control. "Going up, mister?" I didn't say anything, and I didn't look around. He banged the door shut, and the car went up. I jerked open the door to the stairs and raced up them. At the 3rd-floor landing, I heard the elevator coming down, and I waited until its lights flashed and disappeared. Then I ran down the corridor, jerking the gloves over my hands. Eggleston's reception room had a long pebble-glass transom extended from the wall to the door casing. A short metal chain at each end allowed it to hang open a few inches. I cut the chains with the wire snips and let the transom drop gently inward. I swung myself up and through the opening. I landed inside, swinging my feet just in time to avoid crashing down on the chair. I moved the transom back in its original position and taped the chains together again. My wristwatch said 7 o'clock. Eggleston had been gone approximately 30 minutes. Since our appointment was for 8, he'd hardly return before another half hour. That left me a lot of time. To do what? I didn't know what to look for. At any rate, he'd hardly leave anything like this on paper. It would be in his head, something he could tell me. I wondered how hard it would be to make him talk. I sat and waited, and gradually I felt my head turning toward the right, toward the door of the inner office. It was closed and the office was dark, and of course he wasn't there. He wouldn't be sitting in there in the dark. He hadn't expected me to do what I had, so why would he be there? I thought that one over, and my head kept turning toward the door. And finally, I got up and walked over to it and turned the knob. It was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly. I ducked back and flattened myself against the partition, and then I moved away from it and stepped inside and flicked on the flashlight. The beam moved across the desk. He was bent forward a little on his elbows. His hands lay on top of each other carelessly, and the chair was drawn close to the desk, holding his body against it. He wouldn't be talking that night or any other. He was through talking for all time. I knew what had happened before I looked at his head. He had pulled the chair up close to the desk and put his elbows on it because he had wanted to count something. Money. He sat there counting, his suspicions lulled by the fact that the money had been paid quietly, without argument. And then the person, the man or woman, who had handed it over so readily. I moved the flashlight. I couldn't see his face. His chin was resting on his chest and his hat was pulled too low. But I could see his head even with the hat on. Part of it was oozing right out through the crown of the hat. He had never known what hit him. I wasn't sorry he was dead. I'd seen good men killed for no reason, and he hadn't been good or even fair. He'd meant to collect from both sides, from one for keeping quiet and from the other, from me, for talking. I might have foreseen that he would try that. The murderer had. I walked around the desk and opened a drawer. There was nothing in it but a pipe, a can of tobacco, and a half-empty pint of cheap whiskey. If there was anything significant in the thin file of letters, the dog-eared ledger, or the several dozen receipted and unreceipted bills, I didn't know what it was. I felt his pockets as best I could without moving him. I found matches, a wallet containing his credentials, and $6, a package of cigarettes, and a fully loaded .32 automatic. I put those things back where I'd found them and looked down at the desk. There was nothing on it but a day-to-day calendar. The date showing was the following day. I didn't think anything of it for a moment. I turned away and looked around the room carefully, trying to find... I don't know what I was trying to find. I looked down at the calendar again, and then it came to me. It wasn't a mistake. This was one day that Eggleston wouldn't have slipped up on. I flipped back one of the little white leaflets. There was the date, today, and scrawled across it were two notations. Mrs. Luther, 5:45, P. Cosgrove, 8 o'clock. I pulled it loose from the staples and tore it into shreds. I went through the expired calendar slips and tore off a dozen or more of them. I dropped them into the sink, burned them into ashes, and flushed them down the drain. One missing slip might mean something. A number of missing ones wouldn't. The phone rang and I jumped back from it automatically. And then I lifted it and held the receiver against my ear. I waited, and whoever was calling waited. At last there was a whisper.
Mr. Eggleston?
I couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman. The same?
I can't talk very loud, Mr. Eggleston.
I'm in the same position. That sounded like him, I hope.
I'm sorry I couldn't keep our appointment, Mr. Eggleston. Personally. Was it all right?
I'm afraid it isn't. I'm afraid I'll have to insist that you come down.
That's impossible.
I didn't say anything.
Why is it necessary for me to come down?
I think you know why.
You got the money, didn't you? You were taken care of?
It wasn't going to work. I wasn't going to get him or her to come down. That left only one thing to do, startle that whisper into a recognizable voice. Yes, I'm all taken care of. I'm sitting here with the top of my head bashed in, dead. That didn't work either. There was a short silence, and the receiver at the other end of the wire went down with a bang. I pushed Eggleston's body back from the desk and searched it thoroughly. I might as well, I knew now, because I couldn't leave it here. The time of death couldn't be fixed exactly. 30 minutes or an hour would be about as close as the police could come to it. And that, since the real murderer would have a foolproof alibi, left me the only suspect. There was a chance that the elevator boy wouldn't remember my loitering around the lobby. There was a chance that he couldn't describe me if he did remember. But a man on parole, a man with a record, couldn't take those chances. Some way, I'd have to get the body out of the building, hide it. The river would probably be best. My search produced nothing but a few keys. I dropped them back into his coat pocket and stood back studying him. He'd bled very little, and that had been absorbed by his hat and hair. There were no stains to clean up, nothing to do but get him out of there. That was all. I tested the outer door and found it unlocked. I could have walked in instead of climbing. I glanced at the snipped chains at the transom. They would be discovered and arouse comment, but without the body they didn't mean anything. In time, of course, Eggleston's absence would arouse inquiries, but by that time, I hoped, I would have the riddle of Dr. Luther solved. I would know what Eggleston had known and who had killed him. I opened the door, glanced out, and let it close again. Going back into the office, I picked the body up in my arms, carried it to the door, and pulled it open. It was still clear outside. The other offices were quiet and dark. I let the door close behind me and walked swiftly down the corridor to the turn. I stuck my head around it, all clear there, too. I broke into a trot, moving as rapidly as I could with the dead weight I was carrying. I reached the elevators and set the body down in front of the door of the unused one. Panting, I pressed the signal button. My car was parked 2 blocks away. I needed a total of at least 5 minutes. 2 minutes to get there, a minute to get the car off the lot, 2 minutes to get back. Just 5 minutes. I heard the elevator door clang at the bottom of the shaft. Cables whined. I flattened myself against the wall and waited. Light bobbled on the corridor as the elevator moved past and then came back to the landing. The door rattled and banged open. "Going down?" I held my breath, clenched my fist into a hard, leather-covered ball. "Going?" He stuck his head out. My fist came up hammer-like beneath his chin. His head went back, and then he toppled straight forward. I caught him, stretched him out on the floor of the car, and felt his heart. The beat was fast but steady. Aside from a cut lip, he wasn't hurt. The door had closed automatically. I opened it again, holding it with my foot while I reached out and dragged Eggleston inside. A moment later, having worked out the controls of the elevator, I brought it to a stop between 2 floors. I sat down on the stool, brushing the sweat from my eyes. Instantly, the memory of that automatic door brought me back to my feet. I couldn't prop the door open while I went after my car, not with a dead man in one corner and a senseless one in another. There might not be much traffic in the building at night, but obviously there was some. Otherwise, an elevator wouldn't be in operation. Feeling through the operator's pockets, I found what I was looking for, something I'd seen used at various times. It was a short, thin piece of metal rod, an elevator key. Thrust through 2 small overlapping holes in the elevator doors, it permitted them to be opened from the outside. I dropped it into my pocket, shut off the lights, and slowly lowered the car to the first floor. Looking through the small glass door panel, I saw that the lobby was empty. I stepped out, and the door snapped shut, and I hurried away. When I got back, I made a careful left turn and drew up just short of the building entrance. The street was unlighted. The only illumination came from the dim lights of the lobby. Then, easing the left door off the catch, I slid out the right one, leaving it open behind me. I stepped toward the entrance, and I stopped. My heart stopped for a moment. Someone was in there, pounding on the elevator door, pounding and now shouting. I forced myself to walk on. I walked on, slowly, glancing inside as I passed. I couldn't get a good look at him, and he didn't look in my direction at all. He was too busy with his angry pounding and kicking on the elevator door. I waited a moment at the alley and turned and walked back again. Even without that pounding, the elevator operator was due to come to his senses any moment, and if it kept on, if I couldn't get in there. The racket rose to a thunderous crescendo. Then it stopped, and footsteps crossed the lobby. And there was another sound, the slamming of the door to the stairs. He'd given up. He decided to walk. I ran for the entrance, glancing up and down the street. All clear. Thank God this was a side street. Racing through the lobby, I yanked the elevator key from my pocket and jammed it through the overlapping holes in the door. From inside the car came a steady rattling buzz. Signal buttons. Someone wanted to come down. Several people from the sound of things. Probably some of them had already started to walk down. Were already on the stairs, and I couldn't wait. There'd be more. What if I was pinned up there with a dead man and... Something was holding the door of the car, pressing against it. It wouldn't open. It opened a few inches, but the clatter of the signals was growing louder. And above it, from somewhere upstairs, I heard the vicious slamming of a door, then another, then voices calling to each other, and the hollow echo of footsteps coming downward. The door slid open another agonizing inch. I dropped the key, got both hands into the opening, and threw everything I had into one gigantic tug. It groaned, and then it shot open, and the elevator operator sagged through it. He'd revived partly. He'd been leaning against the door, holding it with his weight. He fell forward, knees limp, head down. I gave him a swinging right. He shot backward into the car, struck the back wall, and fell face forward to the floor. Too hard. I hadn't meant to hit him so hard. But no time to think of that now, no time to look at him. I lifted Eggleston's body. I clawed the door open with one hand and staggered outside. Only seconds now. Only a few seconds to get the body into the car and get away. The steps on the stairs were rushing downward. They'd passed the second floor. Any moment the lobby door would open, and I ran toward the entrance. Only a few feet to go. Out of the lobby and across the walk into the car. Only a few feet and... I couldn't make them. I couldn't go back, and I couldn't go forward. Someone had stepped into the entrance. A blue-uniformed cop. He'd been looking at something down the street as he stepped into the entrance, and his head was still turned now. I stopped dead in my tracks, paralyzed from the moment with shock and fear. Then as his head turned toward me, I did the only thing there was to do. I ran forward and hurled the body at him. It struck him high in the chest, obstructing his vision, I hoped, and bowling him over backwards. He yelled and grappled with it blindly, and I darted to one side and sprang for the car. I brought my foot down on the accelerator, grabbing at the doors. They banged shut, and the motor stuttered and roared, and the car leapt ahead. As I shot past the entrance, I caught a confused picture of two figures rolling on the sidewalk and another running towards them from the lobby. Then I was out of the block and in the middle of the next one, nearing the second intersection. Somehow, I got control of myself. And at something near the legal speed limit, I swept through the intersection. I turned left at the next corner, entering an arterial street which led through the center of the downtown district. Not until then did I hear, far to the rear of me, the shrill clatter of a police whistle. Moving automatically with the traffic, I drove through town. I was safe, but for how long? And who could I turn to for help if I needed it? If that cop had spotted my license plates, or if the elevator operator could describe me? Wrapped in thought, driving blindly, I came out on the other side of the business district. I passed an apartment house, and suddenly I thought of Hardesty. He lived in this neighborhood, and he wanted something from me. The man who wants something is a good man to drive a trade with. I found his address, an apartment hotel near the park, and parked my car across the street from it. The lobby clerk was working the switchboard, his back to me. I got into the automatic elevator, punched a button, and rode up. Hardesty came to the door in a dressing gown. He started to smile when he saw me. Then his eyes widened, and the smile faded into a startled frown, and he grabbed my shoulder abruptly and jerked me inside. "Why the hell did you come here? Haven't you got sense enough to—" Breaking off with an angry curse, he strode across the room to a large radio and flicked the switch. "Listen." I listened. Additional information on the man who, a few minutes ago, beat an elevator operator in the Haddon building unconscious, murdered a tenant of the building, and escaped after slugging a police officer with the dead man's body. The murderer is about 6 feet 4 inches tall and has red hair. His complexion is swarthy, he is well-dressed, he is believed to be driving a late-model coupe with an out-of-state license. The elevator operator believes him to be the same man he saw loitering around the building earlier in the evening. No motive is yet apparent for... The radio switch clicked. Hardesty looked at me, grinning, smiling in affable apology. "Sorry, Pat, I was listening to that when you knocked, and I thought, well, that red hair and all." His voice trailed off, and he frowned again. "Oh, so it was you." "I'm the man they're looking for, but I didn't kill anyone. I found the body. I was afraid the murder might be pinned on me, so I tried to get him out of the building." I gave him a brief account of what had happened. He listened absently, with only a pretense of interest, but his face cleared. "Well, they seem to have you tabbed wrong anyway, even to the license on your car. The only thing they've got right is your hair, and they can't haul in every red-haired man in town. They can haul in all those who have criminal records. And that elevator operator could identify me if he saw me again." "I doubt it. And how are the police going to know that the murderer had a criminal record? No, just sit tight for a few days and you'll be all right. 3 or 4 days from now, that elevator jockey wouldn't know you, even if you did have the bad luck to run into him. I hope you're right." "I'm sure of it, Pat. It would have been better, of course, if you just walked out after you discovered the body, but that can't be helped now. Sit down and have a drink. I think you could use one." He poured 2 stiff drinks. "I wonder if there isn't something else you could tell me, Pat. For instance," I tossed down my drink. "For instance, how you happened to be in this detective's office. I had an appointment with him. He was going to tell me what this was all about. I was paroled from Sandstone." "I see. He was going to tell you something. He got killed. What conclusion would you draw from that?" "You mean I shouldn't be curious?" "That's exactly what I mean, Pat. I think you're wrong. I think I should be a damn sight more curious than I have been. The murder is proof that I'm playing blind in a game where a life means nothing. Before tonight, I was just worried. Now I know that I've got to find out what's going on." "How do you propose to go about that, Pat?" "I've already got an opening wedge. Mrs. Luther had an appointment ahead of me tonight. I think it's safe to assume that what Eggleston knew was about her. But she didn't keep that appointment. She told someone else about it, and whoever that was came and killed Eggleston. In other words, her escort wasn't just important to her. In fact, it wasn't as important to her as it was to others, the murderer, for example." "How do you figure that?" "Because she didn't handle it herself. It wouldn't have meant enough to her to commit murder, and murder had to be done. Therefore, she wasn't allowed to keep the appointment." "I see. Good reasoning." "Not very, or you wouldn't say so. It all rests on the assumption that it was Mrs. Luther who telephoned there to the office tonight. I'm sure now that it wasn't. He laughed and made a pass at slapping me on the knee. I drew my leg back. This isn't getting you anywhere, Pat. I told you I'd straighten everything out for you when the proper time came. Now, why don't you just forget it all for the present, and we'll have a good talk someday soon when you're not so upset. I'd like to know now. What do you want with me? You and Doc and whoever's working with you. Damn it, you're gonna have to tell me sometime. You want me on your side of the fence, and I can't be there unless I know your plans. Now, what is it? You're a very smart young man, Pat. Far too shrewd for my liking. I won't be ready for you to act for several weeks yet. If I explain things now, well, you see why I can't. Why take chances, particularly when I don't have to? I see. You want to spring it on me suddenly, without giving me a chance to think. I'll have to jump one or two ways, and yours will look the best. Well, Pat, you want me to kill Doc. Why? Now, Pat, where do you get that idea? All right. I'll kill him. I've had about all I can take. I'm going to do it tonight, and then I'm skipping out. Pat! He gripped my arm. You mustn't. Not now. I shook off his arm, grinning at him. Not now, but later. That's it, isn't it? You do want me to kill him. Let's have the rest of it. I've got nothing more to say, Pat. You'd better leave. I nodded and got up, and then my hand went out in a stiff arm, and he shot backwards off the ottoman. I dived over the coffee table and on top of him, straddling his chest. I grabbed a whiskey glass and struck the rim against the coffee table. Part of it fell away, and I gripped it by the base, holding the long, jagged splinters above his face. His eyes rolled, and he stopped squirming. All right. I'm waiting. This won't get you anywhere, Pat. Talk, and something hard and cold pressed against the back of my neck.
Betcha I'll shoot if you don't get up from there, honey. Betcha.
I dropped the glass and stood up, my hands raised. I turned around. She was grinning that cute, crinkled grin, and her brown eyes were dancing with gay good humor.
What's the matter, baby? Autumn's glad to see Mama?
God almighty.
Poor baby. So sweet and trusting and obliging with Madeline, and all for a little petting. He didn't even get to sleep with her.
No, I didn't. I've got that to be thankful for, at least.
Oh, sour grapes. Don't you think so, Bill?
Very sour. He had risen from the floor and kicked the glass into the fireplace, and now he moved over to her side and put his arm around her. She leaned against him, took his hand into one of hers and raised it up and pressed it tightly against her breast.
There. Hold the gun, will you, Bill? It makes my little fingers tired.
Hardesty took the gun and dropped it into his pocket. We won't need that. Pat's ready to listen to reason, aren't you, Pat? I'm sorry, boy. Some things you can only do the hard way, and this is one of them. You've been licked from the start. Doc knows you've been seeing Madeline. You were supposed to see her. You were bound to see that something was wrong, to be disturbed about it. It was Madeline's job to keep you from taking any action. Never mind. I guess I've understood from the beginning. I just wouldn't let myself believe it was true.
Pat, I didn't want you to get hurt. I told you to see me before you did anything, and you promised you would. If you'd kept that promise, this wouldn't have happened.
I don't think you'd better say any more. I'm afraid if you keep on talking, I'll try to kill you, and nothing will stop me but being killed. You don't want that. Yet, it would spoil your plans. We are sorry, Pat, believe me. I hope there's no hard feelings. Over her? All right. I'm going now. Like another drink first? No. I started for the door.
Wait, Pat, this is business. Bill, maybe we should tell him now. That car, I'm worried about that. Doc shouldn't have bought it so soon.
He shouldn't have, but you know Doc. He's always got to be a jump ahead of everyone else, even if he jumps in the ditch.
But this is different. He wouldn't go in for gestures at a time like this. I've got a feeling...
Nonsense. This Arnhold deal breaks tomorrow night. It'll take him at least a month to wind it up, follow it through the legislature, and collect. How could he... Their eyes met, and he jerked his head at me. She nodded slowly.
I suppose you're right. We'll be in a terrible spot if you aren't.
Of course I'm right. Pat, I don't want to seem discourteous, but perhaps... I heard a suppressed laugh as I went out the door. I drank a great deal of whiskey that night, and the more I drank, the more sober I became. Round midnight, when the stuff was virtually running out of my ears, I went into the bathroom and vomited for what seemed like hours. When it was all out of me, I started drinking again, and I kept on until I fell asleep. I went to bed drunk, with my clothes on, for the first time in my life.